Hello. This is a message to all of you brilliant Football for Kids listeners. Over the past few months, I've been starting to write my own book. It's a football-related story called Charlie and the Mystery of the Missing Cup. Now, I've pretty much finished the first chapter, but I thought to myself, I wonder where the story could go next, and I wonder who to ask. And then I thought, I know exactly who to ask. You lot. The Football for Kids listeners who have given so many brilliant ideas over the last couple of years. So if you were going to help me with writing the book, where do you think the story should go after this? Who do you think is responsible for the missing cup? And how do you think Charlie will find out? Have a listen to the first chapter of the audiobook. And then, if you want to, ask an adult to send an email to footballforkidspodcast@gmail.com or head to www.footballforkidspodcast.com and send a message on the contact form. I really would love to hear your ideas. So here we go. A rough version of the first chapter of my book, Charlie and the Mystery of the Missing Cup. Charlie and the Mystery of the Missing Cup. Written and read by Darren Rees. Chapter 1. It was a wet and windy Monday morning in the school holidays, and Charlie, a football bonkers boy aged 8 3/4, was laying in his bed fast asleep, dreaming. Dreaming of cheesecake. Not any old cheesecake, though. He was dreaming of a football-shaped cheesecake. The inner layer was thick, buttery biscuit. The next layer was thick and creamy cheese, and the outer layer was a mixture of different chocolates patterned like a football. Charlie laid there in his room, surrounded by posters of footballers, with a football pattern duvet, and the floor was covered in football cards, so much so that you couldn't see an inch of a carpet, much to Charlie's mum's annoyance. As Charlie's dream went on, he got closer and closer to eating the delicious cheesecake. He took a knife and cut an almighty chunk out of it, placing it into a bowl. He walked over to the drawer, grabbed a spoon, and as he dived in, there was an almighty crash of thunder, and a gust of wind smashed a rain into his bedroom window, waking him up from his dream. Where Charlie lived was opposite a very special building, a building holding a very special cup, the famous cup. A football cup which has been played for over 100 years. It's made out of brass and has dents all over it, battered from being lifted and dropped and chucked about by all the top teams and all the top players. It's probably one of the most special football cups on earth. Charlie jumped out of bed with his heart still pumping out of his chest from that sudden crash of thunder. He walked from his bed to the window to watch the storm and dodge the lightning, when he noticed across the road in the very special building that the side door was open. It's never normally open, he thought. I wonder if Mrs. Amber is there. Oh, by the way, Mrs. Amber is the caretaker of the building. She's been there for 53 years and has grey permed hair, a tash that nobody has the heart to tell her about, and is always wearing the same thing. A white top, a dark blue skirt which is covered in cat fur, and some heavy-duty boots. Charlie very quickly got himself into one of his 52 football kits. He raced down the stairs and shouted to his mum that he was going across the road to see Mrs. Amber. Charlie's mum was used to Charlie going to see Mrs. Amber. The family had known her ever since they moved in, a kind and warm old lady with a heart of gold. When Charlie crossed the road, he saw 3 people all walking in different directions near the building. A man with a long brown coat which looked like it had seen better days. He had long dark hair and about 3 teeth. He was drenched from the rain and walking past at a fast pace whilst whistling through his teeth as he spoke to himself. What shall I have for my supper? Sesame seed soup. Sesame seed soup. The man walked past Charlie going to his left, and as he stared at him, Charlie thought, how strange. Then another person walked past him going the opposite direction. A lady who had a black and white fur coat, a black hat like the ladies wear at the races. She was caped in beads, but the most unusual thing was she had a Rottweiler dog which looked just like her. The Rottweiler had pink beads, a similar styled hat, and some bright pink lipstick on. The lady chatted away to her dog, and the dog's name appeared to be Patricia. Charlie thought to himself, how very strange. And just as he thought that, a man with a wooden leg came out of nowhere from behind him to cross the road. He had a sleeveless leather vest, a cowboy hat, and a very distinctive wooden peg leg which was fully on show. As he walked, he sung to himself, "You with a wooden leg, poke the fire. You with a wooden leg, poke the fire. You with a wooden leg, poke the fire. You with a wooden leg, poke the fire." Charlie thought to himself, how very strange. As Charlie thought to himself, how very strange, Mrs. Amber came flying out of a side door, screaming at the top of her voice. "Ah! The cup! The famous cup! It's gone!" "What, Mrs. Amber? It can't be. Let me come and have a look with you." As Charlie walked in through the door, he noticed 3 different things. Firstly, the markings of what looked like a walking stick. Secondly, a bright pink bead from a necklace. And lastly, a weird smell in the air. It smelt like soup. Definitely soup. Charlie followed Mrs. Amber through the series of doors to the room where the famous cup was being kept. She was right. It had gone. Nowhere to be seen at all. "Blimmin' heck, Mrs. Amber," said Charlie. "You aren't wrong. It's gone." "You must call the police," said Charlie. I can't call the police. I'll have to notify the owners, and if they find out, I'll lose my job," said Mrs. Amber. "But it's not your fault, Mrs. Amber. You've done nothing wrong. The police will be able to find the thieves who stole it." "No," said Mrs. Amber in a stern voice. "It's my fault and I need to fix it." "Right you are," said Charlie. Mrs. Amber paced around in circles, tapping her walking stick on the floor and saying to herself, "Think, think, think." "I'm trying, Mrs. Amber, but I'm not going to lie. I'm a bit scared you're going to start an earthquake with that walking stick of yours," said Charlie. "Right," Mrs. Amber shouted in a high-pitched voice. "We need to do what the police would do in a situation like this." Or we could just call the police. It's only 3 numbers, it's completely free, and they might even let us have a go on the sirens." "No, Charlie," squealed Mrs. Amber. "First things first, we must preserve and protect the crime scene. Have you got an instant camera in your house, Charlie, or any form of camera?" I think I have," said Charlie. "Well, what are you waiting for? Off you trot. Go and get it. Oh, and for goodness sake, Charlie, don't tell anyone about the missing cup." Charlie looked left and right before running across the road, bursting through his front door and running up the stairs on his hands and feet like an excited dog. "What on earth are you doing?" shouted Charlie's mum. Mrs. Amber's gone mad. She's turned into a crime Charlie suddenly remembered he wasn't to say a word to anyone. "Mrs. Amber's done what, Charlie?" "Nothing!" he shouted as he found the old instant camera in his drawer and flew down the stairs and out the door. Mrs. Amber was waiting outside the building, looking very sketchy. She'd stuck a pair of shades on in the hope that nobody would notice her. But, of course, everyone noticed her. She'd been looking after that place for 53 years. Charlie came running across the road with the camera, breathing heavily and looking very hot and sweaty. As he handed the camera over to Mrs. Amber, a shiny black car with wheels so clean you could see your face in them pulled up on the pavement, and the car's windows slowly wound down. A man with a bald head, which was as shiny as his wheels, with reflective shades on, said, "You don't know us, but we know you, Mrs. Amber." "Who are you?" said Mrs. Amber in a scared and shaken voice. "Never you mind," said the man. "But earlier today we had one of our secret detectives take the famous cup, and if you want it back in time for the cup final next Saturday, you need to find us £50,000. It needs to be in a suitcase, and it needs to be left over by that tree over there. Friday, 10 a.m. If it's not there, You'll never see the cup again. And we mean it. The car sped off with its tyres screeching, leaving marks on the road. Mrs. Amber went into panic mode, and Charlie said, "Right, we've got to call the police now, Mrs. Amber. This has got completely out of control." "No chance," she said. "I've been looking after this place for over half a century, and you and I, Charlie, are going to find the culprits and get the cup back." She started by taking pictures of the evidence in the building and swabbed the door handles for fingerprints. Goodness knows where she got the kit from. When she finished, she said, "In you come, Charlie." She had created an evidence wall in one of the rooms inside the building. Mrs. Amber stuck the pictures on the wall and the pieces of evidence on the table underneath it. "Right, Charlie," she said. "There must have been someone who saw something." "Well, I did see a few strange things when making my way over here, Mrs. Amber," said Charlie. "What do you mean by strange, Charlie?" said Mrs. Amber. "Well, there was a man with long hair and a long coat whistling about his lunch, and there was a lady in a fur coat who dressed her dog up and called it Patricia. And then there was a man with a peg leg singing a funny old song which went, 'You with a wooden leg, poke of fire,' or something like that. They were all right near the building, going in different directions, right at the time that I made my way across the road to investigate." "Charlie, have you seen these people before?" said Mrs. Amber. No, never," Charlie said. "Well," said Mrs. Amber, "we need to do something to attract those people back here so we can interrogate them." Mrs. Amber?" "Yes," said Mrs. Amber. "Interrogate is probably a bit strong, isn't it?" "We've got to get the famous cup back, Charlie, by hook or by crook." "By hook or by crook. She's gone completely mad," Charlie muttered to himself. Mrs. Amber said to Charlie, "Tomorrow we will put on a competition, Charlie. A competition with 3 categories." Charlie interrupted Mrs. Amber and said, "But, Mrs. Amber, tomorrow is Tuesday. We aren't going to get many people entering a competition on a Tuesday." "Well, why not?" said Mrs. Amber. "Well, because it's Tuesday, Mrs. Amber. Not exactly a Saturday or a Sunday. We need to do this sort of thing on the weekend," said Charlie. "Absolutely not," replied Mrs. Amber. "We don't have time. The famous cup is next Saturday. Time is of the essence." Mrs. Amber told Charlie to tell his mum that he had to go and help Mrs. Amber with a project which would help Charlie with his schoolwork. Charlie looked left, right, left again, and one last time to the right before he raced across the road. He opened the door ever so slightly and shouted into his house, "Mum, I'm going to Mrs. Amber. She's helping me with a project for school back at dinner time. Bye!" Charlie's mum started to answer back before the sound of a door slamming cut her off. Charlie and Mrs. Amber started the short walk from the building to Mrs. Amber's house. As Charlie and Mrs. Amber arrived at 543 Templeware Close, Charlie walked up the long, windy path, brushing his hands across the long, overgrown cottage garden plants before arriving at the front door of her house. "You'll have to excuse the cats," said Mrs. Amber. "There's a few of them. They're all very friendly, though." Charlie entered the cottage and was immediately struck by the smell of tuna and the sight of many, many cats. How many cats have you got, Mrs. Amber?" 15, shouted Mrs. Amber. 5 British Shorthairs, 5 Persians, and 5 Scottish Folds. Mrs. Amber was charging around her house like a headless chicken, looking for something. "What are you looking for, Mrs. Amber?" Charlie said. "My box of tricks, Charlie. My box of tricks." "Ah!" Mrs. Amber shouted with a pleased and relieved tone. "Here it is." Mrs. Amber had opened the box of tricks, which was full of arts and crafts gear. She told Charlie to sit up at the table, plonked the box of a fud on the table in front of him, and said it was time to make some posters for the competition. "Right, Mrs. Amber, I thought you were joking. We're actually putting on a competition." "Yes, absolutely we are, Charlie," said Mrs. Amber. What on earth are we going to do?" said Charlie. "Well, Charlie," said Mrs. Amber, "you said that you've never seen those people before, right?" Yes, that's right," replied Charlie. "Well then, we need to entice them back. The man who whistled about his supper, the lady with the Rottweiler called Patricia, and the gentleman with the wooden leg. We're going to have a talent competition," said Mrs. Amber. "You've gone completely mad," said Charlie. "Mark my words, Charlie. We will get to the bottom of this. Now, we've got work to do. We need to make a poster which says talent competition with 3 categories for people to enter. Number 1, the soup competition. Number 2, the dogs that look like their owners competition. And number 3, the fire poker competition. Tuesday, May 14th. Charlie did what he was told and got on with making the posters. Once Mrs. Amber and Charlie finished making the posters, they stuck them in every shop window and on every lamppost 3 miles radius of a special building where the competition would take place. Tuesday afternoon came, and unbelievably, there was a queue outside with a range of people standing there with their dogs, pots of soup, and fire-poking sticks. This was quite possibly the strangest competition that has ever happened in England, maybe even the world. Mrs. Amber said to Charlie, "You must be on the door and signing people in, Charlie. You know what the 3 people look like. You need to have a sharp eye on you today. If one of them turns up, you need to give me an over-exaggerated wink and point to them. Am I understood?" said Mrs. Amber. "Understood," said Charlie. Charlie stood at the door and welcomed all the attendees, noting down their names, still flabbergasted that people had turned up for a weird competition on a Tuesday. He got the numbers and the addresses of all those who were entering the competition. This is genius, thought Charlie. If the 3 come through the door, we can get their addresses and check them out. Mrs. Amber is a blooming genius. As the queue started to get smaller and there were only a handful of people left, Charlie spotted the last 2, who were no other than the lady with the Rottweiler Patricia and the man who whistled about his soup. But there was no man with a peg leg. Charlie got them signed in, and he couldn't believe his luck. "Mrs. Amber!" Charlie shouted, followed by an over-exaggerated wink. Mrs. Amber jumped onto the stage, grabbed hold of a megaphone, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, cooks and dog owners, welcome to the Winkleberry Soup, Dog and Fire Poking Competition. My name is Mrs. Amber, and I am the head judge. The boy over there is Charlie, and he is the deputy head judge. We will taste your soups, view your dogs, and watch your fire poking skills." Mrs. Amber and Charlie then spent the next couple of hours tasting a range of soups, including broccoli, cabbage and sprout soup, a beetroot and purple carrot soup, and a sesame seed soup. The fire poking competition was called off due to health and safety reasons, and only one lady turned up for the dogs that looked like their owner's section. Once the afternoon's events had finished, Charlie and Mrs. Amber reconvened to look at the addresses of the 2 possible thieves. The lady who called her dog Patricia was called Patricia herself, and she lived at 405 Twirler Avenue, and the man who whistled about his sesame seed soup, he lived at 333 Potland Lane. Mrs. Amber and Charlie agreed to meet in the special building at 9 a.m. the next day, as it would be a big day in the mystery of the missing cup.